now move on to the subject of tonight's talk, which is really absolutely fascinating for a number of reasons. I think people realize it immediately. We have a very distinguished speaker who's already had a great success with his book. Mr. Uras was explaining before the seminar tonight that the book is already going into its third edition. I'm sure he'll be pleased to talk about this a bit more during his talk. But not only that, of course. So remember, many of us will have had the same experience, I'm sure, of our first trips to Istanbul, marveling at the 19th century Ottoman architecture of the city, as well as the earlier architecture. But of course, it's something that really only has remained, as it were, a speculation in our imagination until now, when we have this marvelous book that will help us understand it a bit better. And then finally, of course, we have we're going to hear about the great joys of working in archives, which is something I look forward to enormously. And I'm sure our speaker will be pleased to answer questions about that as well. Because again, for many of us, working in archives is one of the great pleasures of intellectual life. Well, there we are. So, Büke, the floor is yours. Please do feel free to speak up to an hour, uninterrupted. If anything goes wrong, we'll tell you. But otherwise, just feel completely comfortable to organize your talk as you should wish. And you have until 8 minutes past 7 at the latest. So, thank you very much indeed.
Thank you very much. Welcome, everyone. Thank you very much. And here is my book, Balyanlar, Balyans in English. The preparation of the book on the Balyan family, who realized significant public buildings of the Ottoman Empire in the 19th century, was mainly motivated by the recent revealing of the Balyan archive. So we knew, for example, Parstulaj also knew that Balyan archive existed, but it was an archive kept privately in a house in Italy, which I will tell the story. The Balyans never wrote down texts revealing their architectural thoughts. They're not ideologists. In the absence of such texts, which would have helped us in understanding their design philosophy, during all the years, the Balyan architecture was evaluated only in the light of their constructed buildings. As a matter of fact, the Balyan historiography was started by Viscount Alfred de Caston, who in 1875 started writing a series of independent articles with the biographies of Balyan family members. And many of the members of the families were still alive when he wrote and published these independent articles in 1875 in the Revue de Constantinople. And in this article, Viscount Alfred de Caston says clearly this sentence: the history of the family can be written with monuments. I think, without knowing, he describes the methodology to be followed for the Balyan historiography until today, for many years to come, with this very sentence. I think the sentence is very important. But with the revealing of the Balyan archive, we had the occasion, finally, to have a different approach to Caston. So this research makes a comprehensive review of the Balyan family architecture archive, which includes not only constructed buildings, but also a number of unbuilt designs that have been partially known until recently, and aimed to introduce a new approach to the history of the Balyan practice through drawings. So such a new and inclusive study on Balyans became possible thanks to this archive. The archive's history is interesting. Sarkis Balyan dies in 1899, but before dying, probably, we don't know the exact date, but probably right after the events, the unfortunate events of 1896, he decides to give the entire family archive to his colleague, who is from Istanbul as well, Leon Güreyan, who right afterwards moves to Italy and moves to Asolo, which is a small city close to Venice, and he builds this family house called Villa Ararat, which still belongs to the family, to Güreyan family. So for nearly 120 years, the Balyan archive was kept privately in Asolo in Villa Ararat by the Güreyan family. But Leon Güreyan, the colleague and for a period also business partner of Sarkis Balyan, died in 1950. Before dying, in his testament, he tells his children to donate the archive to Armenia. But the Soviet period does not enable the family politically to make this donation. And finally, just a few years ago, 4 or 5 years ago, the family, the grandson of Leon Guregyan, donates the entire archive, which is composed of approximately 200 drawings, to Armenia. And today, they are kept in Alexander Tamanyan Architectural Foundation in Erivan. When we say archive, they're not small drawings. We're talking about significantly large drawings of nearly 2 meters, 1 meter drawings. And they represent a very fascinating history of 19th century Ottoman architecture. It took almost 3-year research to find out which projects these designs represented, since they generally did not have a date nor an explanation on them, and most of them remained unbuilt. So it was really a puzzle for me to understand what drawing represented what. Among the achievements of this study, which I am very grateful to many scholars which helped me in these 3 years, especially Bahatamman, Vasilis Kolonnas, they were really of good help for me to be able to identify the single projects. Among the achievements of the study in terms of the functional variety of the archive are, for example, the design proposals and final project of the new Çırağan Palace, a plan from the design process of Beylerbeyi Palace and its site plan, showing some of the buildings which do not exist today. And it's very important because they show the plans. We knew the existence of many of these pavilions from the photography, exterior photos, but we never knew the plans. Now we do have the plans of the parts that are demolished of the Beylerbeyi Palace. A site plan, a very important site plan of Feria palaces, which are this series of seaside mansions from Çırağan to Ortaköy, very monumental axis of palaces. Galatasaray High School original plan, which we did not know the architect for sure until this archive. Then a very important plan for the Ottoman museum history, which I claim it can be the oldest single sheet of museum display in Ottoman history that comes to us, which shows the display of the old weapon collections in Ayarini, in the first courtyard of Topkapı Palace. The decoration project for the dining hall of Şale Köşk of Yıldız Palace for the arrival of Kaiser Wilhelm II. The extension project for Büyük Mabeyn Kiosk of Yıldız Palace. Renovation proposal for the fire-damaged Baba Ali, which is Sublime Port. It's an unimplemented project, but it is excellent because it is the only series of projects which, room by room, Sarkis Balyan gave the definition of the room. And this is right before the exactly the administrative reforms of Abdülhamit II. So we have a perfect testimony to how Tanzimat period administration worked before Abdülhamit II, thanks to these room definitions. Then we have a lot of mansion projects, for example, Esma Sultan Mansion in Kabataş, a lot of industrial facilities such as Dolmabahçe Gas Works, Imperial Fes Factory, which is Fesane Fabrikayı Hümayunu, and probably above all, maybe the most important achievement of this research process was the identification of drawings for the design process of Azizia Mosque, which is a forgotten masterpiece of Sarkis and Agop Balyan, which was the only Selahattin Mosque. Selahattin Mosque means commissioned by the imperial family, to be built with 4 minarets, almost after 250 years. And this is not an unimplemented project. The construction starts. I will share the design process with you afterwards. But with the death of Sultan Abdulaziz, the construction is halted and it is abandoned. So it was never completed. But when we go and read the press of the period, we see that if it were completed, it would have been the biggest mosque in Istanbul, even bigger than Süleymaniye Mosque. So for the first time, we knew the existence of this project, but for the first time, we know how the project would have looked like if it were completed. The members of the family, especially the founder of the family, Kirkor Amira, who was born in 1764, his son Garabet Amira, and their grandchildren, Nikogos, Sarkis, and Agop, were the only architects behind numerous important buildings, but also active participants and subjects of the Ottoman political, social, and cultural realm. Following the traces of Balyan architectural practice, which begins with Kirkor Amira Balyan and lasts 100 years until the death of Sarkis Balyan in 1899, gives us an idea about the transformation. So when we study the history of the family itself, we see the transformation of the architectural profession and the figure of architect in the Ottoman period, the modernization of the figure of architect. We can observe several changes in the same family from one generation to another. For example, the transition from a master-apprentice relationship to a formal architectural education. For example, Kirkor and Garabet does not study architecture. It's a master-apprentice relationship. But the new generation, Sarkis, Nikogos, and Agop, they study in Paris. So this is a big change in the figure of architecture in Ottoman Empire. Then, from local collaboration of suppliers and craftsmen to integration with international commercial network of construction materials and decoration products, which we all studied in the book. From local architectural tradition to changing styles and new construction techniques. For example, I'll show you with some photography later on. Sarkis Balyan brings machinery for the first time to Ottoman construction world and completely revolutionizes the construction in Istanbul, especially in regard of timing. For example, Dolmabahce Palace, for example, is completed in 13 years, which is a large palace. But Beylerbeyi, yes, it is smaller, but it is only completed in 2 years. This is thanks to the machinery brought by Sarkis Balyan to Istanbul and utilized for the first time in Istanbul architectural world. It's something that has never been investigated by the Ottoman architecture historians before. But as we all know, the history of Balyan architecture suffered from a double distortion for a long time. While the mainstream Turkish narratives try to reduce, especially in the early Turkish Republican period and afterwards, they try to reduce the roles of the Balyans in Ottoman architecture and even discredit them. Armenian texts glorified them as geniuses at the expense of other architects. In fact, the Balyans were not responsible for the entire Ottoman architecture during the Tanzimat period, and they were neither mere master builders nor productive contractors, as claimed from time to time. However, the significance of the Balyan family during the final period of the Ottoman architecture is an undeniable fact. For over a century, historians and writers who attempted to rewrite, narrate, and interpret the family history have rarely been able to avoid conflicts, contradictions, and prejudices. There could be a few reasons behind this critical approach to Balyans. I would like to make a small summary of these reasons. The first reason of these prejudices is a worldwide negative judgment formed against the 19th century architectural eclecticism and other styles based on historical models. This is not a case only for Turkey, but it's an international prejudice, especially after the international adoption of modernism in 20th century. The negative approach towards the Balyan family, an ideal representative of pre-modern architecture in Ottoman geography, is also associated with the universal judgment against all kinds of revival styles that were institutionalized and widespread by École des Beaux-Arts in Paris. This prejudice really starts to be forgotten with the blockbuster exhibition in MoMA, New York, about École des Beaux-Arts. So this really is the date. This exhibition clearly gives the opportunity for the first time to get rid of this prejudice towards eclecticism worldwide. The second reason in the case of Turkey is the presence of an ideological bias towards the late Ottoman architecture. From the beginning of 20th century, the Balyan architecture has been considered worthless as an anachronous representation of the regression in imperial history. As a Turkish citizen who studied elementary school and so the rest in Turkey, it has always been given to us that 19th century is the period of regression and decadence politically. As Balyans always worked for the sultans, their buildings and themselves also were regarded significant parts of this decadence. So the Ottoman historiography narrated in the Republican period from 1920s on, just after the dissolution of the empire, defined the 19th century as a period of decline. This decline, besides the failure of the empire with military defeats, also corresponded to an economic and cultural degradation. In the dominant and established narrative of 20th century architectural history, all the Ottoman non-classical norms of 19th century were presented as clear evidences of aesthetic colonization and therefore political failure. The third reason, of course, the most important reason, should be ethnic and political tensions stemming from Turkey's historical development. Garabet and Nikogos Balyan were both Ottoman citizens who fully embraced their identity as Ottomans in the early modern cultural context with transitional boundaries. However, the fact that they were also claimed by Armenian nationalism and counted among the leading figures of Armenian nation in literature, in official presentations later on, would create an ideological obstacle in their acceptance as an important personality of the country's past, especially after the establishment of Turkey as a nation state. So I believe this is the most important reason of this prejudice. If we go back to the archive, what we call as the Balyan archive is actually the personal archive of Sarkis Balyan. Therefore, it consists of many plans and facade drawings, as well as photography, all of which can be dated only after 1850. Since the archive does not include the designs of the older generations of the family members, such as Krikor and Garabet, it cannot be seen as a complete directory of buildings documenting the historical progress of the Balyan practice. So we can only focus on the last generation of Balyan family, not before. Drawings in the Balyan archive offer a lot of new and important data for the authorship debate. This is important because many of the Balyan buildings, like even Dolmabahce Palace, which for sure we know that they were designed by, partially designed, mostly designed by Balyans, they were important subjects of debate. All project sheets in the archive are unsigned. This is important. While on some of them, certain plan schemes are sketched. And these sketches for me are extremely valuable because they show the design process of Ottoman monuments. So as we go back to Kaston, before Ottoman Balyan architecture was regarded only with the finished product, built building. Now, for the first time, we see the sketches, we see plan alternatives. And even in the case of Aziziye Mosque, for example, which is the most typical case, we see the entire design process from basic sketches until very detailed plans and sections. So his preference to entrust his archive to his colleague Güreyan, instead of one of his close relatives living in Istanbul, such as his brother Nikogos' son, Leon, who was architect himself, so who should have had, who should have given value to the family archive, but instead he decides to give the archive not to his architect nephew, but to Leon Güreyan, a colleague who is leaving, he knew he was leaving Istanbul for Italy. Probably it shows, this is related with his concern about the preservation of drawings in a safe environment due to the unstable political context for the Ottoman Armenians, especially after the 1896 events. So let's start seeing that this is Garabet Balyan. We don't have any image of Kirkor, not even a painting. This is a painting post-mortem of Garabet Balyan, which I found in Nubar Library in Paris and published for the first time in the book. This is widely published Sarkis Balyan, which is the last generation of Balyan family, and this is his brother Agop Balyan. So if we come to, as we say, the archive is the archive of Sarkis Balyan. So as a matter of fact, the research took me towards mostly and predominantly towards the life and the work of Sarkis Balyan. Then we found out that he was not only an architect, designer, and constructor, he was also an engineer, a mechanician, and a very important inventor, which Parstoology mentions, but in Bibliothèque Nationale de France, we could manage to find out the drawings of all the inventions of Sarkis Balyan, which is very important. It is more than an amatorial pastime, but it is important, and it really influences well the Istanbul construction world, as I will show you how. Among the works that Sarkis Balyan had developed over the years from 1850s, there are two outstanding inventions. The first one is a revolving steam pump, and the second one is a machine with minimal coal use and inexplosive fascicular boiler. So this definitely shows his interest in mechanical things, and these were all presented to Académie de France in Paris, and therefore we found the drawings in Bibliothèque Nationale de France, except for a few examples that I am giving you a very nice photo here, this one, which shows the Ali Pasha mansion close to Beyazıt. This photo is taken from Beyazıt Tower, under construction. There's, apart these very rare examples, there is no visual material available from the construction sites of monumental buildings, which were realized by the Balyan practice in Istanbul. And it's strangely, their construction took many years, but we don't have any photography about them. And most of the photography taken, they're rare, and they're not the main subject of the photography is never the construction itself. For example, in this case, it is an Istanbul panorama taken from the Beyazıt Tower. I will show you the construction of the Aziziye Mosque later on. It is just a Bosphorus panorama, and Aziziye Mosque is just a detail on the corner. So the main subject of this documentation was never the construction itself. I think this is important, but a very important testimony about the construction of Dolmabahce Palace, which is kind of the same date with the invention of photography. And in the last phases of Dolmabahce Palace, it is photographed, but it was almost completed. But the main testimony does not come from a photographer, but it comes from a traveling writer. English author Albert Smith, who had the opportunity to observe the construction of the palace during his one-month stay in 1849, saw the early phases of the construction when the outer walls were under construction. In his book, he describes this very ramp, which we know that Balyans continued to use after Dolmabahce Palace as well, because this is 10 years after Dolmabahce Palace in Ali Pasha Mansion, and we're seeing the exact ramp that Albert Smith writes in these words. This is Albert Smith writing. We had been far enough along the Bosphorus to see the new palace, which the Sultan is building on its edge, in the European style. I noticed here an odd arrangement of the scaffolding. The masons work without ladders, but make an enormous inclined plane, go from the ground to a platform on the scaffolding, at a great height above it. Up these, the porters carry the stones, mortar, etc., so that it is perfectly practicable for a mule to ascend with a load of materials to any height. So the lack of photography, the lack of visual documentation to show the construction site is kind of satisfied with the traveler writers. The introduction of modern technologies, for example, the machines, by the Industrial Revolution into the Ottoman construction environment, was made possible to a large extent, and probably exclusively, by Sarkis Balyan's personal interest and efforts. So his inventions that I discussed before really make part of this interest that revolutionized the Ottoman construction environment. An important model for Sarkis Balyan in terms of construction site organization comes from Ottoman Empire itself. It's not always Paris. Well, Paris is always, and London always is a good reference point, but it's another very important and neglected reference point is Egypt. For example, as you know, when these palaces were being built in Egypt, Suez Canal was also being built. It's an enormous task. And from 1859, the construction started. But to reduce the costs of the construction of Suez Canal, Said Pasha approved a decision to oblige 25,000 Egyptian peasants, in the French documents they're called corvées, to work in the construction site each month for free. So it's kind of slavery, not kind of, it is slavery. After hundreds of workers lost their lives due to poor working conditions, based on the mandatory service system called corvée in the French documents, a reaction against the employment of the slave workers developed all over around the world in 1860s. Great Britain, thinking that the management of the Suez Canal by the French would cause problems in access to India, put particular pressure on the Ottoman government by using mandatory service as a pretext. And at the same time, the escalating American Civil War also created a sensitivity in the world public opinion about slavery. So as a result, a global sensitivity and international pressure provoked by Great Britain, French Emperor Napoleon III, abolished in 1864 this mandatory system in Egypt for unpaid employment of workers. As a result, the legal termination of such ancient construction practices based on hand power would speed up by force, because Suez Canal was not even arrived to a half. It opened up the mechanization process of the construction site of Suez Canal, which still was then part of the Ottoman Empire. So the modernity reference does not come from Istanbul, but it comes from Egypt. Abdulaziz visits Egypt right afterwards to see the construction on site. And definitely Sarkis Balyan is in relationship with the French companies who from Marseille bringing all the machine à vapeur à Suez for the construction process. Especially after this date, the definitely Suez Canal construction date is also the turning point for the mechanization of Istanbul imperial construction projects. So this is a world-size model for large-scale construction site, especially for the hierarchical cooperation arrangements and the use of new technology, primarily steam power. Steam power new technologies produced by the French were delivered to the canal by ships from Marseille port. And Sarkis Balyan is the Istanbul person who, for the first time, brings these steam machines to Istanbul. And this is written in Ottoman press and also by in the French press. French press, for example, I'm making a reference to the French press of the time. Beylerbeyi Palace, I'm quoting, a large and magnificent building like our new opera house, Opera Garnier, was completed in only 2 years. Yıldız Kiosk, built of chipped stone and marble, has almost the same size as our French National Library and was completed in less than 6 months. So these are important achievements, and this is thanks to Sarkis Balyan for the bringing of steam machines Istanbul for the first time. He is also responsible for founding the first construction company in Ottoman Empire, which is called in Ottoman Şirket-i Nafiye-i Osmaniye. He founded this in 1873, which became an important tool for the rational organization of construction sites. The construction sites running at the same time, for example, Aziziye Mosque, Çırağan Mosque, and Pertevniyel Valide Sultan Mosques are built more or less the same time. And they are managed in relation with each other for practical and economic reasons. For example, the same distribution of materials for different sites came from the same sources. For example, the same columns, serpentine columns, marble columns we see in Aziziye Mosque, but we also see in Çırağan Mosque. They come from the same source, distributed with Şirket-i Nafiye-i Osmaniye. Then we come with the 1870s, again with this modernization of the architectural figure in Ottoman Empire. Sarkis Balyan starts using photography as a tool of publicity for the first time in Ottoman architectural history. So we found this album in the Getty Museum in Los Angeles. It is the only copy that I could find out, but we know that he commissioned Abdullah Biraderler, Abdullah Frère, to have very large volumes of photography of Çırağan Palace and send it to all the important leaders of the period. Queen Victoria, the Tsar of Russia, the Shah of Iran, and the only copy that I could find out is to the Le Roi d'Espagne, as you can read, which is today in Getty Museum. This is important how Sarkis Balyan was modern enough to use photography as a tool of publicity. This is also another important representation of the modern Ottoman figure. How did modernity come to the Ottoman figure? In 1831, Mahmud II made the dissolution of the Imperial Architects Organization, which is Hassa Mimarlar Ocağı. So, in the Hassa Mimarlar Ocağı, all the architects worked for the state. With the dissolution in 1831 of this famous institution, based on bureaucratic reforms, the self-employed Ottoman architect status could be possible. So the modern Ottoman architect figure that is independent from the Ottoman governmental institutions could be possible only after the dissolution of this ocak. So from that moment on, the architects themselves could present as modern individual figures with respect. So they could differentiate themselves from the craftsmen and became individual professionals with a recognized social status and intellectual identity. So only from this point on, we can see a portrait of an Ottoman architect. We do not have a portrait of an Ottoman architect, unlike the Western culture, until Balyans. Garabet Balyan's portrait, which you can see now, is the first Ottoman architect portrait in history. That, for example, as you know, there are many depictions of Sinan, but they're not realistic. They're never the architect itself is never the main subject. It's always either a panorama of Istanbul and the bearded figure is attributed to be Sinan. But here we see the main figure of the composition is the architect itself, and the first time we see it is Garabet Balyan. Then Sarkis Balyan also will have his portraits pictured. Garabet Balyan is portrayed in front of a black background, wearing the Istanbulin and a fez on his head. And it's important, there's a nice detail that I liked. He's holding this plan, as you can see, with a compass, with a golden compass. The plan is not one of the palaces he did, but it is the church of Surpazvadzin in Beşiktaş, who himself he financed and built. So now we start the archive. Some examples of the archive. Why is the archive important? Apart from the information, the new information it gave us. As you know, there's a long-lasting authorship discussion regarding the Balyans, about whether they also participated in the design process beside the construction or not. So this archive, which gives us for the first time the design process of the Balyan family. Chief master, the debate comes from the fact that chief master builders or building supervisors whose names were mentioned in official correspondence concerning the constructions were frequently accepted as architects of the building. So the terminology in Ottoman history is vague. Is architect, the terminology for architecture is not as defined as the Western world. This is one of the most important problems. In this comprehensive archive, the presence of draft project sheets, witnessing the design process, and sketches, as I said, and some of the drawings showing alternative plan schemes in search of different designs clearly are new proofs to show that Balyans actually are the designers themselves of these monumental buildings. So now let's start to see some examples of the archive. This is an important sheet. It's a monumental sheet. It's nearly 2 meters of Beylerbeyi Palace site plan. Here you can see Bosphorus, and this is the section of the Beylerbeyi Palace. Today it's a museum. This is a design model integrating the old palace of Mahmud II into a new complex. So some of the buildings are pre-existing and some of the buildings are added afterwards by the next generations of Balyans. But here there's an important thing. There are some buildings, for example, this, Kadınlar Ağası, and this, Paşa Dairesi, which do not exist anymore. It was demolished at the turn of 20th century for reasons that we do not know. Thanks to this drawing, for the first time, we have the plans of these important buildings, which are important parts of Beylerbeyi Palace. Then we go to Çırağan Palace. Çırağan Palace, as we know, is today this. This is the final project of Çırağan Palace, which was done in 1870, final project, which today still exists. But a series of drawings that in the archive that we see, which are polychrome, show different alternatives of Çırağan Palace before the final project. The nice thing about this, that each alternative project has something for the something kept for the final project. For example, the Serlian arches are kept, or the rhythm is kept. So we have a series of 10 drawings for a time of approximately 10 years, I assume, and each drawing keeps some items for the final project to come. Then we go to, this is a project that I love. It is the Çırağan Palace, it is Chalet Kiosk Dining Hall, redecorated for the arrival of Kaiser Wilhelm II. Here we have the mother of pearl inlaid doors brought from Çırağan Palace, which burned afterwards. These are key elements, as you can see clearly, defining the desired representation of language towards important guests. In this case, it's Kaiser Wilhelm II. And we are at the time of Abdülhamit II. It is no more the time of Abdülaziz, so things have changed. In search of a new representation for the future of the empire has chosen to emphasize its classical Islamic legacy for the first time. It is something that we do not see in Abdülaziz in this dimension, by abandoning its almost 2 centuries of relationship with Western models. So they take these existing mother of pearl inlaid doors from Çırağan and they reuse it in the dining hall of Chalet Kiosk in Yıldız Palace, where Kaiser Wilhelm would be entertained. Then there are many mentioned projects, which are clearly, their mentions, kiosks and pavilions, they clearly represent a systematic search for an ideal plan. While the kiosks and pavilions were built in masonry during this period and dominated by Western influences, with their prismatic mass organization, triangular pediments and pilasters, strict symmetry, but they still, not in this case, but many of them, they still have the selamlık and harem section typical to the Ottoman Empire. So, but also at the same time, the influence of the late Renaissance plans presented by Palladio villas, and also the contemporary French models, and mostly Tuileries Palace, of course, as well as the pre-Tanzimat local civil architectural models with central hall plan scheme, orta sofralı odalar. This is a drawing very dear to me because it was, for me, it's the easiest to define where it is, and for me it was the most difficult. It took me 2 years to understand where this was, And I think it is the easiest drawing for me that should have been to understand. This is Ayerini, which is very clear, which is a Byzantine church in the first courtyard of Topkapı Palace. And these rectangular shapes, which I did not understand what they were for a long time, then I understood that they are displays of guns, and they're specifically designed by Sarkis Balyan in cast iron. I found the photography perfectly matching and with this plan. Today, the photography is kept in the Metropolitan Museum in New York. I published them together next to the plan in the book, so you can compare. It's a perfect match. And I may claim this is not the oldest museum display in Ottoman Empire history. The oldest museum is still in the same building, but it's 20 years before this. We are in 1877. But this is the oldest single sheet of Ottoman museum display that we have today. Hopefully we will find the one in 1851 day as well. So then we come to the most important discovery of the research process, which lasted for 3 years. This is the Viscount Caston's 1875 article, specifically addressed only for the Azizia Mosque. And it says, the great architectural movement in the Ottoman Empire during the reign of Sultan Abdulaziz Khan. His Excellency Sarkis Bey Balyan, the engineer architect of Machka Armory, Azizia Mosque, imperial palaces and monuments. This is Caston in 1875. So in that time, he's talking about the Le Grand Mouvement architectural, great architectural movement. So clearly there's a detachment from the usual styles, and they also named this, which is unusual for the period. Normally the styles are named after in history, and this is at that time they're saying they're trying to name it, and they call it New Ottoman style. This is the term that Caston uses in 1875, and the masterpiece of this style today that has reached to us is Pertevniyal Valide Sultan Mosque in Aksaray. But the most monumental project could have been Azizia Mosque. As I said, Azizia Mosque was started, so it is not a project that stayed on paper. Here we see a rare photography of the construction site right behind Dolmabahce Palace, where today there is Swiss Hotel. So with the construction lasts for 2 years. And I should have shown, but you see the akaretler's row houses. Akaretler has this curve, and you can clearly, with this picture, you can see why akaretler has this curve, because it wanted to reach the plane of the entrance of the mosque. So if the mosque were completed, akaretler was exactly going towards the entry of the mosque. So that also explained to me why akaretler row houses has this curve. So the walls, you can see the retainment wall clearly. The wall stayed until the 1980s. This masterpiece, Sedat Hakkı masterpiece of Taşlık Gazinosu, Taşlık Casino, was built on the retaining wall of Sarkis Balyan's mosque. So I think it's one of the most precious hybrid togetherness in 20th century Turkish architecture. Unfortunately, they're all demolished in 1980s for the construction of Swiss Hotel. So back to the Azizia Mosque. This is a photo dated 1875, taken by Berggren. And let's see finally this monumental project. The project is the first Ottoman mosque, imperial mosque, to have 4 minarets after 250 years. So it is important. As all the newspapers, magazines internationally underline, if it were completed, it would have been the biggest mosque in Istanbul, which I find a little bit exaggerated. Maybe Süleymaniye would stay still bigger. So in the book, I made some personal studies, let's say, because there's no scale as you see in the drawings. So in the plan, I took different wall thicknesses And if I take the wall thickness slightly thinner, the dome is bigger than Hagia Sophia. In any case, it's bigger than Hagia Sophia. But if I make the thickness of the wall 1.2, which is very acceptable for a monumental building of this size, then it clearly passes Süleymaniye easily. So maybe the press of the period is not exaggerating when they say it would have been the biggest mosque of Istanbul. So the most important thing of the research is really the finding out of the project. How did I find the project? It was internationally coinvolgente, I don't know how to say. What I did is I took the drawings in Erivan, in Alexander Tamanyan. Luckily, I'm living in Paris, and in Nubar Library in Paris, we have this drawing. So when I put the drawing in Nubar Library next to the plan drawing in Erivan, it was a perfect match. Plus, there is no picture, there is no project visually given in the Ottoman press or French press of the period. It's only words, description, but also the description. So the drawings in Paris, drawings in Erivan, and the descriptions in the press perfectly matched. And also we clearly see the 4 minarets, as you see, 1, 2, 3, 4. So let's analyze, as the final thing of this presentation, the mosque. The mosque is important because it does not, for example, this is the only facade drawing that we have of the mosque, and it is the one of the mihrab. You can here see the mihrab towards the Bosphorus because we're on the European side. So the Bosphorus facade does not reflect the mass organization of the Ottoman classical architecture, which is spread over the courtyard, portico level, with various levels, typical to Yeni Cami, typical to Beyazıt, and so on, Süleymaniye, of course, which is spread over the courtyard, portico level, with various levels, articulations, such as semi-domes and small domes. It emulates the dome setup of the late medieval Islamic structure. So it is not referring to Ottoman classical architecture, but late medieval Islamic structures detached from the high, massive and robust walls. It is associated with the Bursa Green Mosque, of course, and mostly, to my belief, Memluk style of Egypt. Especially Sultan Hassan Mosque has clear references to this project. It should not be surprising to see the integration of an architectural language, which can be considered quite new for the imperial capital, in the design of a Selatin mosque, imperial mosque, built at the will of an Ottoman Sultan, not in Egypt, but in Istanbul. The Caliph, the Ottoman Sultan himself, is the Caliph of the entire Islamic world, embracing the cultural permeability of the medieval Mediterranean Islamic civilization. So this style should be evaluated together with the other contemporary buildings. They were formed by the Orientalist influences that reached the peak during the period of Sultan Abdulaziz. There are 2 sections, and this is one of the 2 sections of the courtyard. And the plan is very important because
sells weapons and armor.
In the final plan,
and food court sells
this
food.
is the implemented final plan dated 1874. And as you know, in the Tanzimat period, we have hanging arches placed in the harem walls of the Tanzimat mosque. So here, deliberately, it moves, it completely denies the Tanzimat style of using these arches in the facade. But it comes back, it moves towards the building typology of classical Ottoman religious architecture with central dome, but as you can see, 4 elephant feet scheme, which is for the last time used in Yeni Cami, the new mosque, hundreds of years ago. So there's this scheme of 4 elephant feet for a structure, which was the main element of dome structure during the classical period and largely abandoned in the Tanzimat period mosque designs. So it is revived after hundreds of years later. But the main entrance, as you see, is an open courtyard, which is very typical to Tanzimat period. So we do not have the closed courtyard of the classical periods, and we do not have the ablution fountain in the middle. So we have an Ottoman, typical Tanzimat open courtyard like Ortaköy Mosque, Nur Osmaniye Mosque, and so on. But together with the classical 4 feet elephant structure scheme holding the dome. So it's a mixture of different things. And for the final image, we have the interior perspective by Sarkis Balyan, and this is signed. This is important because only the drawings, the 4 of the 8 drawings kept in Nubar Library in Paris, are the only signed drawings of Balyan family in Balyan history, and they're signed Sarkis Bey, Sarkis Balyan. So this corresponds perfectly to the plans of Azizia Mosque kept in Erivan. And Azizia Mosque's alternative design proposals, their different alternative plans, did not ignore the common characteristics of the mosque that were gained during the Tanzimat period, such as, if we go back here, such as Sultan's prayer lodges here, open courtyard, as I said. But while the volumes shaped by the Tanzimat protocol were kept out of necessity, they were used together with the aspects of the classical Ottoman architecture, especially the dome structure, as I said, that were found important to be revived. So this is some important examples of the archive, which again is consisting of approximately 100 drawings of different sizes, which unfortunately I could never have the chance. I was not permitted to see the archive. I was not permitted, as I said, so I always studied with the PDF that were given to me. I wish I had seen them personally, because I'm sure it could be revealing some other information that from the PDF is not possible to reveal. But this is how I had to work, and that's it. Thank you very much. I think this is all I have for the presentation.
Well, thank you very much indeed for that absolutely fascinating and fluent presentation. You really are greatly in your debt. You know, it's one of those presentations which is so important, as you rightly said at the beginning. None of us will be able to visit Istanbul and see it in the same way again. So really, you have changed our lives. Really, you certainly changed our perspectives. So that's really remarkable that you've done that. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Well, there are many different ways one can, of course, ask questions about all this, but I wonder whether you could talk a little bit about the political dimension, because my understanding is that the Balyans were, if I've understood correctly, were close to the Sultan. They must have been. But what were the links like, and to what extent do you think the design conceptions and the intentions of the buildings were actually discussed with the Sultan, or was it always with an intermediary? So I suppose my question therefore can be divided up into a number of different parts. You know, what were their relations? How do they interact with the Sublime Porte? And then to what extent do you think that these Tanzimat meetings were explicitly part of the architectural program, or was it kind of almost accidental, picking up on cultural styles rather than political? There we are.
Of course. I think the answer cannot be given. I think the same. The answer is not the same for each generation of Balyan family. So each generation we are seeing, even in the lifetime of the same members of the family, we see completely different relationships with the imperial family. If we start from the Kirkor, which is the founder of the family, which more or less corresponds to Mahmud II, we have love and hate relationship. For example, he is the official architect of Mahmud II, but he's exiled twice, and to Kayseri, for example. Then we have Garabet. Garabet is very important for Ottoman Armenian identity. And both Kirkor and Garabet, they are Amira Balyans, which means Amira, as you know, is a title which finished with the Tanzimat reforms, which corresponded, it comes from Emir in Arabic, it corresponds to something like Lord, but it meant a lot for the Armenian community of the period. And it is very important that how they embraced their identity of Ottoman Armenians. And this, how they embraced, is very different from generation to generation. For example, Garabet, the way that Garabet embraces the Ottoman Armenian identity is through religion. This is very important. It is a Tanzimat period. For the first time, the construction of churches are permitted. So we have a lot of church constructions. He himself is financing also church constructions, as we saw in his portrait. And he is considered a very conservative, religious leader. Leader not only as an architect, because he's also leader in the political issues of the administration of Ottoman Armenian community in Istanbul. So he's a very political figure as well. But his sons, who studies in Paris, and they see the 1848 revolution themselves while they were in Paris, they become liberals. And they're against their own father, which they think he's very religious, very retro, how do you say, retro figure in the administration.
Reactionary.
Reactionary, exactly. So we see this generational different approaches to different things. Then again, if you go back to your question, again, we have serious problems with the sultans. For example, in the case of Sarkis Balyan, the most important one, we always have problems. But with Sarkis Balyan, now he's completely a modern architect figure, which means he does not make part of any Ottoman architectural institutions. Hassa Mimarlar Ocağı is closed. There is no institution that he makes part of. So when he is accused of taking some of the construction money to himself, there is no institution that he can lean to. So he's completely alone. So he escapes the country and he stays in exile in France for 10 years. This is also probably a personal story, but also it shows two things. First, there is no institution anymore in Ottoman Empire, architectural institution, to protect him. He's alone because he's now a modern architect figure, a semi-independent. We saw that. So alone, he's also needs to be protected, but there is no institution to protect him. Second, he is accused by Abdülhamit II. Of course, this is a personal issue, but we cannot deny that things have changed from Abdülaziz in the same lifetime of Sarkis Balyan, which we know perfectly that with Sultan Abdülaziz, he's very close friends. For example, there are letters he's saying, I'm not doing the Aziziye Mosque myself, I'm not the designer, Sultan Abdülaziz is the designer. It's like he exaggerates, of course, this very romanticized way of showing the design process, but he says Sultan Abdülaziz makes some preliminary drawings with red pencil, and Sarkis follows them. Of course, this is an exaggeration, but it shows the good relationship between Abdülaziz and Sarkis Balyan. Then with Abdülhamit, as you know, things changed. And again, it's a personal issue. The financial issue is a personal issue, but we cannot regard this personal issue independent from how Ottoman Armenians start to be treated differently in Abdülhamit II's period. So things have changed with Abdülhamit II, definitely, during the lifetime of Sarkis Balyan. So your question is really different for each member of the family, and even during the lifetime of each member, there are different figures, sultans, and different stories going on at the same time.
Thank you so much. And the second part of the question, what extent do you think that the politics of the time are explicitly part of the designs, the architectural designs? And what extent do you think it's serendipitous or by accident?
Balyan family is definitely, we cannot study the Balyan family independent from the politics, because they're not exclusively working for the imperial family, but the designs that they have done apart from the commissions of the imperial family are very rare, and they're insignificant buildings. I have some examples given in the book, some middle-class buildings in Beyoğlu, but they're very insignificant drawings. Either they worked for the imperial family or the pashas who worked for the imperial family themselves. So they really make part of the political, economical, 19th century Ottoman Istanbul scene. So we cannot regard their architecture independent from all these political, social events going on. This also explains why and how the archive finished in Italy also. Why he did not decide to leave it to his nephew, Levon, who was an architect himself. He could have left him. He's a relative architect, so definitely into sheet architectural drawings, but he decides to give it to Leon Greyan, who he knew he was going to Italy. So we cannot really study Balyans without studying the Ottoman political scene of the same period.
Yes, absolutely. But what I would like to try to get an appreciation of is do you think that the Sublime Porte or the sultans themselves had an idea as to how the design should be, so that it would fit into their vision of the empire? Or do you think the designs were coming from the Balyan almost entirely themselves, and they would simply get them approved? Which way is this cultural inference working, do you think?
We don't know exactly. There are some very small notes which are given by the Balyans. As I said, Balyan never wrote any texts. So the only regard to the study of Balyan architecture or life is really from either the press or buildings or the archive as a new material. But I wish they did, but they never wrote anything. So we don't know perfectly. The only thing that we have is the interview of Sarkis Balyan that he gave in 1875 to Viscount Caston, as I mentioned, in the Revue de Constantinople. It is the only interview given by Sarkis Balyan to a journalist. And it is very important because in that very interview, as I said before, he says that the Aziziye Mosque is not a design of him, but it's a design of his of Sultan Abdul Aziz, which is very interesting to hear. Of course, it's a romanticization of the design process, but evidently that shows that there was a clear connection during the design process between the two.
Fascinating.
Also, we also know that during the Abdulaziz period, there are many gifts, for example. None of the Ottoman documents tell Balyans as architects. This is also one of the debates. But Western press and Western travelers always show Balyans as architects, and they never give another names. They always say either Armenian architect that I met, for example, there are many names, or they really give the name Balyans. But we have many documents in the Ottoman archives about, for example, snuff boxes given as a gift for the works held in, for example, Pertevniyal Valide Sultan Mosque. So this is a clear proof that they were the architects.
Yes. Well, thank you so much. Now, please just put your hand up, or anything if you'd like to say anything. But Elif has her hand up, so Elif, please go ahead.
Hello, thank you very much. It's been two of my favourite subjects, architecture and history. So it's been very interesting. I've got 2 or 3 small questions. I was wondering, is any of those drawings digitized that we can look at them, if you know, or like available online? No? Unfortunately.
I have to say, can I answer immediately?
Yeah, sure.
As I said, I was given only the PDF, and I am afraid the governmental institution is not very collaborative for the researchers, I'm afraid. In future, I hope it will change. I really wished that these drawings could be exhibited in Istanbul. As I said, these are brilliant and beautiful drawings. Like as objects, they're beautiful drawings and they're monumental drawings. For example, the Çırağan Palace drawings are 2 meters long. It would have been wonderful to exhibit them in Istanbul and to regard them as tools of, recommunication, which is very important, I assume. But unfortunately, for the time being, we're denied of such a tool, and they're not digitalized. Back to your question. Okay,
thank you. And I was wondering, is your book in English at all, or is it?
It's made 2 different editions. Yeah. One is Turkish and one in English. So we have the image that you see is Balyanlar in Turkish, and the English version is exactly the same book. Everything is perfectly same, and it's called Balyans.
Okay, thank you. And last question, if I may. Do you know if they continued with architecture like outside of the Ottoman Empire, or did they?
Yes, very good question. Very good question. There's an interesting story actually. So. Sarkis Balyan, as you said, as I said, died in 1899. For me, the end of the Balyan practice is the death of Sarkis Balyan, because all the other figures are minor figures. So the real 3 generations, in some books they say 5 generations. No, there are 3 generations, Krikor, Garabet, and Sarkis and his brothers. It finishes with 1899. Then there is the son of Nikogos, which is the nephew of Sarkis, Levon, who never built anything, who never continued independently the Balyan practice. He chose to become, he chose to work in a governmental institution and moved to Paris and died in Paris. So I would not regard him as the continuation of the Balyan practice. Really, the scale is completely different. The vision is completely different. And the time is completely different. It's a time that, it's a private story, but the private stories, especially in that part of the world, we cannot study them independent from the political turmoils of the time. But very strangely, the Balyan name continues in Egypt. Okay. It's an interesting story, because one of the heykeltıraş nasıl denir? Carvers. One of the carvers of Garabet takes the name of Balyan. They have absolutely no blood connection, but out of respect, it's a very, very qualified carver. I'm not saying sculptor, it's a carver, really, in term. Yeah. He made lots of carvings in the churches and the facades of Balyan buildings, so really collaborates with the atelier for 2 generations. And he takes, for respect, the name Balyan. Then, with the 1896 events, he moves to Bulgaria or Romania, I don't remember, to the Balkans, to Bulgaria. Then he comes back, but his son, Garo Balyan, decides not to go back to Turkey, but he moves to Egypt. So we have in Egypt, 1920s, 1930s, an incredibly sophisticated designer called Garo Balyan, who makes very beautiful Art Deco buildings in Cairo. Okay. And it has nothing to do with the Balyan family by blood, but the family name really reaches until 1930s, not in Turkey, but in Egypt.
Okay, thank you very much.
Yes.
Well, thank you. Philip Mansell was the next person with their hand up. So please, Philip. But nice to see you.
About the Sultans, there are accounts of Abdulmejid visiting Dolmabahce.
Well, could you speak up a little bit, please, Philip? You're a little bit quiet.
I think there are accounts of Abdulmejid visiting Dolmabahce, and Abdulaziz is recorded as doing sketches for frescoes on ceilings for his painter Klebovsky, and right. He liked pictures of battleships. He was very keen on the Ottoman
Correct.
Navy. So I'm sure somebody could put together more evidence of direct imperial involvement in these extraordinary buildings, which do delineate Istanbul almost as much as Sinan's mosques. And Abdul Hamid was a carpenter, and I imagine he probably had some input into the design of the Hamidiyye Mosque at Yildiz.
I definitely agree. This is something to study, definitely. But again, we do not have too many written accounts. And that is the missing point, unfortunately.
Yeah.
Would you like to ask anything more, Philip, or
Maybe
you have the floor?
Maybe the absence of documents, I'm beginning to argue like a conspiracy theorist, but maybe the sultans are putting down sketches, just imperial orders, and they're so special that they're not kept, maybe.
Actually, I was very interested in the paintings during the research process, and I found out very interesting information. For example, when I went, it's one of the advantages that I'm living in Paris. As you know, Séchan is the French decorator who decorated partially. There are many other names, and you know the official history always says only Séchan, but it's not the case. Séchan is responsible only for part of the Dolmabahce Palace. They're mostly Ottoman Armenian locals, Istanbul people, who worked and decorated the palace, which are never named. Anyway, that's another story. But when I went to Dro archives, for example, I saw that when Séchan passed away, his entire collection was auctioned off for 3 consecutive days. So it was a very big collection. Unfortunately, the auction catalogs of the period do not show any images, but they explain each item. So when I looked at the auction catalog of Séchan's succession after his death, I found out very precious information about the contribution of French in the construction of Dolmabahce Palace and Dolmabahce Theater. For example, Dolmabahce Theater's author was always problematic, like we did not know exactly who it was. And in the catalog, it is clearly given that there are 2 auctions of the 2 drawings, Omon, it gives the name, of the interior of the project of the Dolmabahce Theater. So thanks to these auction catalogs, I could find out for sure the author of the interior of Dolmabahce Imperial Theater, for example. Another source that I found, for example, is another important reference is the Barbizon School, which is contemporary to Abdulaziz. For example, Rosa Luxemburg is, as you know, is an important figure in Barbizon School depicting animals. And it is the most important female figure of the period in Paris. And his brother, strangely, is the author of the statues, the bronze statues, some of the bronze statues that were commissioned and bought by Sultan Abdulaziz and brought to decorate the palaces. So I found it, for me, it was interesting because Rosa Luxemburg, as you know, depicts only animals, and his brother sends these animals as bronze statues to Istanbul. So I tried to understand the relationship of the animal decorations typical to Sultan Abdulaziz. As you know, Sultan Abdulaziz either has navy or animals. And I saw that Monsieur Masson, always called Monsieur Masson in all Turkish press, is a very important figure in Barbizon School as well. So the decoration of Beylerbeyi, for example, the animal figures come directly from Barbizon schools, not only as an inspirational line, but also they are direct friends and collaborators, also family members. That, I think, is very interesting. to find out these links.
Yes. Does that answer your question, Philip? You would...
Does, yes. One day.
I couldn't hear you, sorry.
The arts.
Could you repeat? I apologize.
Maybe you will write one day about Sultan Abdul Aziz and the arts.
Oh, I hope I will.
Well, thank you very much. Now we move on to Isla's question. So please go ahead.
Hello.
Hi, thank you very much for this discussion and for publishing this important book.
Thank you.
I think that for many Istanbulus or visitors, it might be surprising to learn that a family of Christian Armenians were so instrumental in creating the city's, iconic Islamic architecture. And I wondered if in your research, if you came across any contemporaneous discussions about this, was it by any means, controversial at all at the time, or was it just viewed as the natural order of things?
There's absolutely nothing during Abdulaziz's reign, absolutely nothing against the fact that a mosque was designed by a Christian, Ottoman Christian. There's absolutely nothing against. I'm definitely not. And I agree, it is very interesting, but let's not forget that until 1920s, half of the Istanbul population was non-Muslims. So we cannot view things from today's point of view. We have to understand how things were then. And things were very different, especially in the Abdulaziz time. Things really start to change with Abdulhamid II, I would say. For example, in Azizia Mosque, I did not show you all the drawings, but it has different alternatives, the Azizia Mosque. And one of the alternatives show a cross plan with 4 minarets. I mean, it is
brilliant.
For me, even for me, it is a scandal. And so I went to my fellow friend and scholar who I esteem a lot, Bahatanman, who I assume is the most important scholar for Ottoman mosque architecture. I said to him, Mr. Tamman, there is something wrong. Like, I am seeing 4 minarets with a cross plan. Like, how this is possible? And will I be able to publish this drawing? And Mr. Tamman said, Büke, this is possible. This was Abdulaziz, and probably it was revealing some integrating some Byzantine spirit to it. I have no idea, but it is not a design that was accepted. I agree. The final design is plan design is completely different. But even the fact that Balyan could introduce to Abdulaziz an imperial mosque, this is an imperial mosque with 4 minarets. It's not a small mosque. It's a very important mosque as a cross plan. And it's an official version. I think this is something to think about.
Well, that's really quite moving, the idea.
Yeah, even like me in 2020, I was intimidated how to integrate it to my book.
Yeah.
I said, like, should I avoid printing it? Like, I did not understand what to do. And Mr. Tamman really said, no, Büke, this is an historical document. You don't give any comments. You introduce the historical document, and it is part of the historical fact. And that's how I regarded the thing.
So it is in the book.
It is in the book.
Great. Thank you very much.
I thank you.
Well, as I say, if you would like to address our speaker, please do indicate that. But just whilst we're waiting, perhaps, for any more comments, I mean, there are just a couple of little things which come to mind, which are, first of all, why were you not permitted to view the original archive? That really is very unusual.
It's a long story, actually.
Did they say why?
Yes, I mean, I prefer not to enter details, but a book was published in Armenia about the archive. And so I don't want to say anything bad, but the book had some problems. Some things were missing, some things were wrong. So when they decided to translate in Turkish, they found out that it was problematic to translate in Turkish, not only from the point of nationalistic point of view of the book. That's completely something different, but things were wrongly put. And so then I was given the opportunity to study the same archive. So as this book was already there, the institution said, okay, the book is already exists. Why are we doing another, why are we helping another book? So there was some political things going on, which completely independent from me, but I think that was the reason.
It's the politics of studying archives is of course a different topic in itself, but a fascinating one. And also, I was very interested in your description of the architect's ocak, which was closed down. Are you able to say a little bit more about that? I mean, when was it founded, and how long did it last, and that kind of thing?
It was founded in the classical period. Of course, there are different. It has evolved into different things, different terminology as well. But from Fatih period on, we see this governmental will to have this ocak, to have this institution of architects. So from the conquest of Constantinople, Istanbul, we see this. Of course, it evolved into different things in the centuries, but the final period comes with Mahmud II, and during the bureaucratic reforms of the Tanzimat periods, he abolishes this. And as a result, the architects, as I said, they do not make part of a governmental institutions, and they become slowly semi-independent and then independent. And also this is important. For example, why this Balyan archive finished in Italy? Because Balyans, the third generation of Balyans, were semi-independent Ottoman architects. They did not make part of the Ottoman institutions. So the archives stayed to themselves. If, for example, an 18th century Ottoman architectural design, they worked for the government, they only exclusively worked for the monumental projects, of course, and the drawings today make part of the Başbakanlık Osmanlı Arşivleri, the Ottoman archives. So the figure of semi-independent or independent Ottoman architect also enabled the first steps of private Ottoman architecture archives, which is very important. In this regard, the Balyan archive is chronologically one of the first Ottoman independent architectural archives. I don't think there is any other earlier archive of this size and of this importance. I'm not only talking about the qualities of the archive itself, but chronologically also, it is one of the first private Ottoman archives, because before there was no private Ottoman architects or working for the Sultan. You know, they only worked for an institution. So the story of the archive also tells a lot about the figure, the transformation of the figure of Ottoman architect.
Yes, indeed,
How many languages you must have to know to do this?
I'm sorry?
I was just wondering how many languages you must know to be able to research all this.
Very good question. I know, unfortunately, apart from Turkish, I know only 3 Western languages. I don't know, unfortunately, Ottoman and Armenian, unfortunately. But I was very lucky because I was offered this book. And when I was offered this book, I said, please, let's have an Ottoman scholar and an Armenian scholar, which was accepted. And all Ottoman Armenian archives were studied specifically for my research by now they're very dear people to me as well. The same way, the Ottoman archives were researched and translated for me during the research process. And this is fundamental, it's very important, and I'm grateful for it.
No, that's brilliant. I was just thinking there's so many different languages and different...
Definitely.
Yeah.
I would like to say one final thing. For example, in the book, I don't know if you have had a chance to look at the book. I wanted to see the relationship of the contemporary Ottoman architecture with poetry, for example.
Yeah.
And it was really interesting because there are many poems written with great optimism.
Okay.
When, for example, Çırağan Palace is completed. I talked with Nevzat Sayın, for example, this very good contemporary Turkish architect. I asked him, like, do you know anyone today in Turkey who completes a building and there's a poem written to the building itself? Like, I don't know anything about this. And in Ottoman case, it was completely different. The contemporary architecture really becomes the subject of lyric poetry, for example. But the sad thing, I published these beautiful, beautiful poems on Çırağan Palace, which were originally written in Armenian. And today, unfortunately, as a Turkish citizen, I'm sad to say, they do not exist in Turkish. So to be able to find the poetry of Thomas Terzian, for example, this beautiful poem written in the 1870s, I had to consult a book published in New York in the 1890s on Armenian poetry. Like this, I have difficulty in accepting.
Yeah, I think there is a lot to still do and translate and
definitely
to people's consciousness.
Definitely, I totally agree.
Thank you. Now I think that John Scott has a question. Please go ahead, John.
Very, very briefly. Wonderful, wonderful talk. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Scott.
One thing I wondered is why doesn't Dolmabahce sink or Balyan sink? I mean, they're built right on the shore. I mean, who achieved this?
A very good question. I could find only one section of Dolmabahce Palace during the research process. I found it in Başbakanlık Osmanlı Arşivleri, and it's a section of Muayyede Salonu, which is very unusual section because it's the only section where you can see it in the book. It's not made by Balyans. It's made to reinforce the chandelier, you know, the monumental chandelier in the Muayyede Salonu after the 1894 earthquake. But the section shows the inner space between the roof, the outer roof, and the inner dome. So it is the only visual documentation that I could see as a section of the Dolmabahce Palace, which I think is very precious. But unfortunately, this section, because it is not from the construction period of the Dolmabahce Palace, but it's a much later drawing, and it is concerned, it's not about the foundation, but the chandelier's reinforcement. It does not show the sections finishes on where you walk, the plane. It does not go down showing the foundations. It's unfortunate. So I do not have any, I could not see any visual documentation showing the foundations of the Dolmabahce Palace. I know that they used, like in Venice, you know, the wooden pillars. I don't know how to say in English, but there is no visual documentation of it, unfortunately.
Very interesting. Slightly unrelated. Why did Çırağan end up so austere when it had such an elaborate start? The plans that were abandoned, the facade that was abandoned.
Yes, very good question, actually. Çırağan Palace has two different, you know, there's first the Çırağan Palace of Mahmud II, then it is demolished by Abdülmecit, and then with the demolition until the final project, we have 15 years. So it was the most problematic drawings in the archive, actually, because they had these monumental drawings which absolutely have no reference to understand where they belong to, except the blue line which shows the Bosphorus in front. So what I did is I I suspected they should be Çırağan because they're these monumental buildings, and the entry is from the shorter side, not from the, like the Water mentions. They're always from the shorter side of the volumetry. So I understood that they were Çırağan, but I did not have any proof. So I had to, from Abdülmecid to Abdülaziz, I had to study all the press to understand the different stages of the proposals. And they're really well documented in Ottoman press and French press. So we have two different design stages. First design stage is commissioned to Nikogos Balyan by Abdülmecid, which is completely different. It is monochrome. It looks like Dolmabahce Palace. And it is a neo-Baroque kind of feel. Then Abdülmecid dies and Nikogos dies. So Abdülaziz comes and commissions to his brothers, Sarkis and Agop. Now the time has changed. Abdülaziz's time is completely different. We have polychromy, we have Orientalism, we have many different things, and definitely not Dolmabahce Palace style. So with the change of sultans and change of architects for the same building project, we have different stages and different proposals. But again, as I said before, the nice thing is from each proposal, we have a little hint to the final project. That was also a proof for me to understand that there are really different stages of Çırağan. For example, from the start, they use the Sirlian arch. Then there's the rhythm. The rhythm is always kept more or less the same. So clearly things have changed visually, but the inner plan is probably the same, the harem, selam, the orta sofa, and so on. So, the envelope changes, but inside is the same. The facilities are the same, necessities are the same. So things, although from the first vision, they look changed, but things really add up together. And I think this is fun to see. And I think it's for the first time in Ottoman architecture that we see, again, for the Çırağan Palace and for the Aziziye Mosque, for the first time we see the design process with details of a monumental Ottoman building. I think this is very important.
Thank you very much.
Well, thank you. I think we've had an extraordinarily interesting evening, one that was wide-ranging and thought-provoking, and all we can do is say, first of all, thank you for gracing our society, and we wish you all good fortune in your future publishing
Thank you very much.
projects, which of course we will look forward to enormously now that we've had the chance to hear from you. So I think we should thank our speaker.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
And and really and wish you a very, very good evening and all success in the sales of the book.
Thank you so much. I really enjoyed being with you. Thank you so much. Have a good night.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
And you too. Right.
Bye-bye.
Good evening.